program of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. We're honored to have Vice Admiral John Miller with us today to talk a little bit about U.S. foreign policy, particularly as it pertains to the Middle East and the Gulf. My name is Tim Horgan, and I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization centered in New Hampshire and at the forefront of global conversations. As a nonpartisan organization, we are interested in having deep, expert-led conversations about critical global issues, but we do not take any stances on policy, party, politics, or anything of that nature. So as always, the views expressed here today are those of the speaker, not necessarily of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. A couple of thank yous to get to before we go ahead and get started here. We are in the Offices of Education for All Children in downtown Portsmouth. We appreciate them opening up their space to this collaboration, and really appreciate the wonderful work that they do abroad in Kenya specifically, but again centered here in New Hampshire, showing the strength of New Hampshire organizations to engage with the world. We also want to thank the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition for bringing the Vice Admiral up to do some conversations about the 3 Ds of defense, development, and diplomacy with a great global community here in New Hampshire. USGLC does some great work in DC as well as around the country, supporting public diplomacy, supporting U.S. engagement. We've done a couple of things with their president, Liz Scher. If you have not seen those already, I encourage you to check them out. But I want to bring in our wonderful speaker here today to answer a few questions that I have. I hope the audience watching has the same questions, but I would love to just sort of bring you in and talk a little bit first about your career in the military, in the Navy. You've flagged several ships. I won't name them all because there are far too many to name. You worked all over the world, I think it's fair to say, but really sort of focused in the Gulf region, and spent some good time in different areas. But just give us a little bit of a background, being here in Portsmouth, the home of the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. I think we have a lot of people who might just be interested simply in your background.
Well, Tim, thanks for having me. It's great to be here and be with you. I was fortunate enough to spend 36 and a half years on active duty in the Navy. I started out as an F-14 backseater and did that for a couple of decades. Very fortunate to have done so. Served on a number of ships and served on them all around the world. I had command of the USS Constellation, which is one of our aircraft carriers. In fact, I was the decommissioning CO of Constellation, so I was the final CO after about 42 years of service for the ship. Then once I became a flag officer, I did spend most of my time in the Middle East, either living there. I spent almost 5 years living in Bahrain, and then if I wasn't living there, then I was performing duties that were associated with things that were going on in the Middle East, including a tour at Central Command down in Tampa, Florida. So it was a great privilege for me to have served in the Navy. Learned a lot. As you mentioned, I sailed basically all around the world more than once, and had a chance to see and meet a lot of interesting people and do some very interesting things.
Well, I appreciate you giving us the time of your insights for this conversation on sort of the U.S. interests in Middle East policy. We had an interesting conversation earlier with, as I said, the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. And one of the things that struck me is your contention that the U.S. for the past decade plus has not actually had a Middle East strategy. We have tried to pivot away multiple times to other issues, mainly East Asia. But can you talk to us a little bit about what you have seen sort of broadly, 10,000-foot view in terms of U.S. policy towards the Middle East, and whether or not we've been effective in what we want to achieve there?
I don't think we've been anywhere near as effective as we could be when we look at our policy in the Middle East. One of the challenges that we face is that as a global power, and that's an economic power, it's a diplomatic power, it's a military power. We have a lot of responsibilities around the world. The world is a busy place, and there are lots of places that we would like to be that we don't necessarily have the sufficient resources to be. In the Middle East, in particular over the last decade or so, has been one of the recipients of the lack of ability to be everywhere all at once, all of the time. And so we stated as a policy position way back in 2013 that we were going to pivot away from the Middle East, pivot toward Asia. That's really to answer the emerging and likely enduring threat that we face from China. But there's an old saying in the region, the United States can forget about the Middle East, but the Middle East is not going to forget about us. And so we find ourselves continually drawn back to the Middle East for various crises. If you look at what our policy is, and this really spans a number of administrations, at least the last three, it's not really clear what our policy position is in the Middle East. Do we want to partner with like-minded nations that are interested in the security and stability of the region? Do we want them to go on their own and be able to provide their own stability and security, and we just hope that it goes well? Do we want other powers that are part of the strategic competition around the planet that include China and Russia? Do we want them to play a greater role in the region? And oftentimes we will say one thing and do another. You look at the way and the timing when we left Afghanistan, that sows doubt into the minds of the leaders in the region in terms of our reliability as a partner. You look at some of the recent activities that have been conducted either by Iran or by Iranian proxies, or suspected at least to be by Iranian proxies because it's difficult to attribute, that are deeds that attack our friends and partners in the region, and there is no response from the United States, and it's difficult for the regional partners to respond on their own. So I do think we lack a coherent policy. We lack a policy that can span a number of administrations, which is really what the nations in the region are looking for, a long-term, reliable partner. And I don't think we've shown that in some time.
And can you talk to us a little bit about, understanding that you are retired, you are not speaking for the U.S. government at this point, what do you think the U.S. interests in the Middle East are, should be, and how can we achieve some of those goals broadly?
Well, we have a variety of interests in the Middle East. It's a little disingenuous to say that oil and gas is not one of them. Oil and gas is what fuels the global economy today. That may change. It looks like it is changing. But for the short term, and by short term I mean the next couple of decades, oil and gas are going to continue to be important. And so it's the safe, efficient, free movement of oil and gas out of the Gulf, combined with the safe, efficient, free movement of commodities and food, for example, that goes into the Gulf. That's an interest to the Middle East. That makes it of interest to the United States. It's of interest to the global economy writ large, and so that's an interest to the United States. So we're linked in ways that we simply cannot divorce ourselves from any involvement in the region. And so we have to make it clear that we're involved, that our involvement is really designed to make sure that the region is stable and secure, and that if you're sailing a ship from somewhere in the world through the Strait of Hormuz into the Arabian Gulf, you can sail in and out without the fear of being attacked. And that includes other places like we see happening today in the southern part of the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, where the Houthis are interfering with shipping. They've sunk a ship, they've killed some sailors. They're causing an increase in price, they're causing decreases in supply chain throughout the world that impacts the whole global economy. So we're going to have to be involved just as other nations need to be involved, and just as the United Nations needs to be involved.
Now, of course, there are a lot of current day issues that we see going on in the Middle East, but let's roll the clock back about 2 decades. We of course have been much more involved in the Middle East over the past 20 plus years, since 9/11. But we saw an unsuccessful attempt at democratization in Afghanistan. We've seen many challenges stemming from this region in terms of terrorism being exported globally. But can you talk to us a little bit about sort of the approach, the military approach to the Middle East, and where it's seen successes and where it's seen some challenges?
Well, we've had a lot of success militarily in the Middle East, and I don't want that to be lost on people. If you look at the campaign in Afghanistan that followed in the immediate wake of the 9/11 attacks, from a military standpoint, it was a highly successful operation. And it wasn't just the United States that was involved in that. We brought along NATO, we brought along other nations, a lot of coalition partners. At one point down at Central Command in Tampa, there were 64 different nations that had senior representatives that were helping us with the effort. So from a purely military standpoint, that was a successful effort. The same can be said in the effort in Iraq, during Operation Iraqi Freedom. That, from a military standpoint, was a success. What needed to follow in both cases, and what didn't necessarily follow with a robustness that was necessary, were the diplomatic efforts, the developmental efforts that would help these countries transition to being free and open democracies in ways that emulate the democracies in the West. There's a lot of different reasons for that. Not to be lost on people was the fact that simply not every country wants to live like the people in the United States live, or like the people in Western Europe live. Not all people want to have that kind of governance. And so they have to have a desire for it, so that we can use our diplomatic efforts, our developmental efforts to help with infrastructure and that sort of thing, to move progress along in terms of their ability to govern themselves and to do so peacefully, so that they're a stable partner in the region for not just the United States, but for everyone.
As we talked today about the 3Ds, development, diplomacy, and defense, one of the things that came up is the idea of supporting our diplomatic community even further than we already have. However, in light of our approach to Afghanistan, to Iraq, we did not see that diplomacy and that development work at the levels that it needed to. A lot of that work was left to the military. Is that a effective use of military capabilities? Is that something we should be asking of the military? Or do we need to reprioritize and empower organizations such as the State Department, USAID, other development organizations to do that work for us in these places, particularly in the Middle East, where we do want to see stability and growth?
In the U.S. military and a lot of militaries around the world, we tend to parse out conflict into a number of different phases. You start with phase 0, which is peace, and then you progress all the way through at least phase 4, which would be stability operations. If you look at Iraqi Freedom, for example, and I think that's a very good example, we transitioned from phase 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 quite eloquently and effectively, and we achieved our military aims very quickly. I don't think we were adequately prepared as a government or as a coalition or as a military for what was going to need to be done during the phase 4 operations. And if you remember, we concluded major combat operations within a matter of a couple of months, but then you fast forward to 2006, 2007, 2008, 5 years after the military activity, and we still had significant resistance in the region, significant violence throughout all of Iraq. That was a result of being unable to establish the governance required to make sure that the country worked peacefully. Is that military work? I don't think in the long term we want it to be military work. We want that sort of work to be work that's done by people like the State Department, like U.S. Agency for International Development, agencies that are meant by their nature and existence to be diplomatic agencies, to be developmental agencies. That's where that sort of thing happens. And so I remember a time when we were tracking the amount of electricity being produced in Baghdad every day because we knew that was essential to making Baghdad a more stable and peaceful place. That's not necessarily work. It's work the military can do, but I don't know that it's necessarily work we want the military to do.
So we saw the exit from Afghanistan. Regardless of who you think is at fault and who's to blame for what, that's not what we're here for. We can broadly agree that it was not a good look for the U.S. on the exit strategy. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that exit, what that retreat from Afghanistan means in the long term in sort of the viewpoint of the Middle East, of what the U.S. can and will provide moving forward?
Part of establishing relationships in any part of the world is becoming a partner, being a partner that other nations think they can trust. And they want to be able to trust that nation for the long haul. They want to be able to trust that whatever it is we promised at the beginning will still be true at the end. That wasn't the case in Afghanistan. To say that our departure from Afghanistan was an elegant is a very polite way of talking about what really happened. And it resulted in a loss of trust not only among the partners in the region, and you still, when you go to the region and talk to them about long-term relationships, many times they'll answer with a simple word: Afghanistan. And so we know that we have a deficit of trust amongst the partners in the region. But we also have a deficit of trust amongst the people in NATO. NATO alliance is a critically important alliance to us. It's the most successful alliance in military history. But when the United States says, we're not terribly concerned what you think about it, we're going to go, all the NATO partners that were there, NATO made significant contributions in Afghanistan, but they relied on the United States for a lot of enabling activities. And so they didn't have the option to stay there on their own. So when we left, without necessarily their agreement, we cut into that trust deficit in ways that take a long time to recover from. And so I think we ought to consider ourselves in the recovery mode and be partaking activities that will allow people to understand that we are in fact a partner that can be trusted and be trusted over the long haul.
Well, of course, there was another incident in the 2015 to 2019 timeframe that may not have been a great trust-building exercise, and that's the joint plan of action on Iran's nuclear program, the Iran nuclear deal. Again, regardless of what you may or may not think of the deal itself and whether or not it was a good deal, we did exit that deal in a way that was not a trust-building exercise. Can you talk to us a little bit about, sort of the exit from that as well, and what it means for U.S. prestige, trust, etc. in the Middle East?
I have to tell you, I'm one of the people that was not in favor of the JCPOA when it was signed, and there were a couple reasons for that. One thing is it's the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. I didn't think it was comprehensive. I didn't think it was much of a plan. It didn't include Iranian malign activities. It didn't include, in particular, ballistic missile development, which Iran is increasingly improving their capabilities on virtually a daily basis. Missiles that are both longer range and more accurate than ever before. So I wasn't in favor of the deal. I also wasn't in favor of getting out of the deal the way we got out of it. So, the old adage, I was against it before I was for it, because it really, again, eroded the trust that people had in the United States. One of the things I wasn't in favor of with the JCPOA is how we structured it as essentially an executive action with a approval process that didn't go through the Congress like a normal treaty, but it went through the United Nations, which holds no weight, which means when the administration that negotiated that deal left, the next administration had the ability to leave the deal. And so all of the partners, the P5 that were involved in it, I think they felt that we did not deal in a trustful and thoughtful way. And of course the Iranians, who gave up some political capital within their own country in order to make the agreement in the first place, they've been burned once. Shame on us. If they get burned twice, it's shame on them. And so I think that's why this administration has found it so difficult to get back into the deal. And were we to get into some sort of a deal, it would need to be structured in a different way so that it is the voice of the American people that say, yes, this is the kind of deal that we want to have for the long term. And people can then understand that all of the conditions that are in the deal, some of them are going to be great, some of them are going to be not so great, but all of them become, they carry the force of law, the force of a treaty.
So we have had a long-standing, difficult relationship with Iran, to put it nicely. We see the axis of resistance very active in the Middle East. Can you tell us a little bit about your views on how much control Iran has over those different militias and armed groups, and what their sort of overall goal is in the region as they support these different armed groups?
It's important to acknowledge that Iran is a malign actor in the region. It is part of their constitutional charter to spread the revolution to other nations around the region and around the world. And they're busy doing that on a daily basis. And they've been busy doing that since 1979. The relationship they have with some of their proxies varies from proxy to proxy. So the malign activity is mostly carried out either by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. These are the more zealot members of the revolution who are interested in creating instability so that the revolution can take root in other places around the region. But then they also deal with organizations like Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And Hezbollah, I would tell you, is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Iran Revolutionary Guard. They have more control over them than they do any of their other proxies. But they have proxies that are in Iraq. They have proxies that are in Syria and operate against the United States and against other coalition partners that are interested in helping the Syrian people find their way out of civil war and into freedom. And then there's, of course, the Houthis. They have less control over the Houthis, I think, than any of their other proxies because the Houthis rely on the Iranian Revolutionary Guard to supply them with sophisticated weapons. They're doing that. We see it. It is ballistic missiles that are capable of hitting ships. It is anti-ship cruise missiles. It's unmanned surface and subsurface craft. So there's a full-blown press on the part of the Houthis to control the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. There are 6 major strategic maritime choke points in the world, and 3 of them are in this region: the Suez Canal, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the southern part of the Red Sea, and the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranians have either some control or full control of at least those 3 strategic choke points. Because if you shut down the southern part of the Red Sea, then ships don't transit through the Suez Canal. That is a significant source of income for the Egyptians, so the Egyptians are paying a price. It also is going to make the things that we use all around the world more expensive and later than they would be, because these ships have to sail around, and it adds a significant cost to the price of each container. So Iran enjoys this activity. They enjoy the fact that they can put pressure on any of those three choke points at any time. And in fact, they are putting pressure on all three of them right now.
Well, and that brings us to the big elephant in the room, of course, when it comes to the Middle East these days, the Israel-Hamas war. This is obviously a very complex issue, a very complex, long-standing issue. Can you give us a little bit of insights into just sort of U.S. interests in this war and how we have approached it, and your assessment of what's been going on there for the past several months?
Well, I think U.S. policy in the region has really been guided by a couple of principles. One is a principle of the right of Israel to exist, and you've heard administration officials talk about that quite routinely since October 7th. Another principle is the desire to keep the war from expanding, and there remains a significant chance that the war could expand, and rather exponentially if it were to expand. So escalation management is a key part of what the administration is trying to do, and I think most people are supportive of that effort. In fact, I think the only entity that is interested in seeing the war expand beyond Gaza and Hamas is Hamas themselves. But I think the administration and other parties, including the Israelis and Lebanese Hezbollah, led by Nasrallah, have done a good job of keeping the escalation under control. And I think that's a positive thing, and I think that we want to do it. We are at a difficult stage now where clearly the people that live in Gaza, Palestinians that aren't associated in any way with Hamas, are not supporters of Hamas, are in a very desperate strait. They can't really go north because the Israelis control all the area to the north. They can't go south because the Egyptians will not let them go south. And there's additional fighting that the Israelis feel like they need to do against Hamas in order to complete their war goals, which is the destruction of Hamas as both a military entity, but also as an entity that is capable of governance. Because they don't want to have to repeat October 7th 3 or 4 years from now after Hamas reconstitutes itself. So it's a very tricky situation. There is some very good diplomacy going on amongst players in the region that are trying to help. There are efforts that are being undertaken to improve humanitarian aid. Obviously, the best way to improve humanitarian aid is to cease the hostilities, return the hostages back to where they belong, and then begin the rebuilding phase. And that would allow more humanitarian aid to come into Gaza the way it typically has for decades, which is through land routes, either from Israel or from Egypt.
And as a Navy man yourself, can you give us any insights into the feasibility, the difficulties, the challenges that the Navy will see in trying to build up this pier that they want to go into Gaza to help with this humanitarian relief?
Well, there's an immediate need for humanitarian relief. That's today. And you can do so much over the land routes. But I would tell you the land routes are controlled by the Israelis and they're controlled by the Egyptians. And we have significant relationships and leverage with both of those countries. And so we ought to, if we're not, and I suspect that we're trying behind the scenes, we ought to be encouraging a greater use of the existing facilities that are in place. There are some airdrops going on. That's helpful, but it's very difficult to get aid in quantity if you're going to deliver it through the air. And of course, there's always potential difficulties. And I know some Palestinians were killed, unfortunately, when one of the parachutes for one of the packages didn't open. So you can build a pier. We have the capability to do it. We have a system to do it. It's a joint endeavor, like pretty much all endeavors in the U.S. military are these days. So the Army will be heavily involved, the Navy will be involved, the Marine Corps will be involved. The issue that I have with the pier, one is it'll be some time before it's in place and functional. And then more importantly is how do we ensure security and how we build this pier and bring it into service so that it actually can deliver humanitarian aid without putting American boots on the ground or on the pier and on the ground, but in harm's way or potentially in harm's way. I don't see how we do that without Americans being on the ground in Gaza. And I'm not sure that that's the route that we want to take.
Well, Admiral, thank you so much for your time. I wish we could spend all day talking to you, but I know you got to get off to Maine for a couple of events you'll be doing out there with our sister organization, the World Affairs Council of Maine. So thank you so very much for giving us your time, your insights, and we really look forward to continuing these kind of conversations well into the future. And thank you to everyone who is watching the recording of this conversation. We hope that you have found it enlightening, insightful, and helpful to your better understanding of the world.
Tim, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure being with you.